Welcome. Talking about the grand solar minimum theory at the moment is rather like beating a dead horse, because there is absolutely no sign as yet of a grand solar minimum. And so we're going to take a look at that today and see what has actually been happening. GSM may as well stand for Grand Solar Misinformation. Those that have been pushing this particular idea have been claiming for nearly a decade that the sun is about to go into a rapid decline, a state rather like the Maunder minimum. The only problem is that it is not. In fact, the reverse is true. Activity has in fact increased in the current cycle compared to the last one, the exact opposite of what they were predicting. In fact, every one of their predictions has been wrong. The dates and size of minima and maxima, for example, have been out by years. So why is nobody talking about GSM anymore? It's rather like it's a hot potato. They don't want to talk about the subject. The GSM channels have been off the air for months. Many of them taken down their old posts, so we can't go back and see what they were predicting 2 or 3 years ago. Why? As I said, the sun has been increasingly active when they said it would be declining sharply. Well, that, to say the least, is embarrassing. We've had sunspots, flares and CMEs galore, which is an inconvenient fact compared with their predictions. We've seen aurora at low latitudes, which is very rare. So that means this is a more active cycle. In fact, I've seen aurora twice now from southern Maryland, and I've never seen it here before. What is the antidote to misinformation? Well, data. Let's take a look at the solar data. For example, sunspots. This is a plot of the sunspots for the last 14 years. On the left we have solar cycle 24, which peaked out at a sunspot number of 116. On the right we have the current status of solar cycle 25. Now what we should be looking at here is the solid red line, the monthly smooth number. That's what we use to measure the timing and size of the solar cycles. And if you compare the peak of solar cycle 24 with the current status of solar 25, you see this. Solar cycle 25 is already 30% above where solar cycle 24 was. The main spokesman for Grand Solar Minimum, Zarkova, now admits that she is wrong. Here's a letter, and she said in paper 2015 and press releases, we were speaking about solar activity or the average sunspot number reduction. This means that the maximum number of sunspots in solar cycle 26 will be 60 to 70% lower than solar cycle 24. That would be around about 30, which is weaker than that of others already. Solar cycle 25 will be about 10% lower. That would put it at about 100. In one of her diagrams it showed 90. So somewhere between 90 and 100 is what she's predicting for this particular cycle, and we're at 150. So she's already out by 50%. So much for the 2% error she claimed in her work. Well, how can we tell what's happening with the solar cycle? One thing to do is to look at where the sunspots are. This is a famous sunspot butterfly diagram which shows that at the beginning of the cycle, the sunspots appear at high latitudes and slowly drift towards the equator. When both hemispheres reach the equator, we get solar minimum, marked here by the blue arrows. So where are we in the current cycle? Do the latitudes of the current sunspots show a sudden drop towards the equator to indicate that we're getting close to solar minimum? Well, let's take a look. Here are the latitudes of the sunspots so far. Red at the bottom is the southern hemisphere, blue at the top is the northern hemisphere. And you can see they are converging towards the equator, but in a rather steady and linear way. The southern hemisphere is converging more rapidly than the northern hemisphere, which means it will probably reach the equator in about 2030. And the northern hemisphere more slowly will be about 2031. So somewhere between 2030 and 2031 should be when we have solar minimum. But note there is no sudden drop-off in the latitude of these sunspots to indicate that we're about to start into a grand solar minimum or even reach minimum. So therefore, there is no evidence that that is about to happen. As I said earlier, we've got an increasing flare rate. Grand Solar Minimum News said something really stupid in its most recent video, An X flare is just a large M flare. Well, I would point out that the scale between M and X is not a linear scale, it's a logarithmic scale. So an X1 flare is 10 times larger than an M1 flare. So it's not just a large M flare, it's a very, very big M flare, 10 times bigger. Anyway, this is the plot of the number of X flares so far this cycle in red, and the equivalent number for solar cycle 24 in blue. And you can see that we're running nearly 3 times as many X flares this cycle than we were last cycle. And we've already exceeded the total number of X flares in solar cycle 24 by about 60%. So this is a very active cycle and it looks as though it's continuing to do so. There's no sign of this rate slowing down. Well, let's take a look at coronal mass ejections, and we don't get quite the same pictures we do with X flares and M flares. Yes, solar cycle 25's coronal mass ejection rate is higher than solar cycle 24, but only by 25%. Why this difference? Well, the main reason is that coronal mass ejections are caused by 2 different mechanisms. One's a filament eruption, and the second is a big flare, which can cause a filament eruption. And so the increase is probably due to the flares, but there's still a steady rate of coronal mass ejections from filament eruptions going on all the time. So you'd expect there to be a smaller difference between coronal mass ejections and flares between the 2 cycles, which is what we've got. Okay, so where are we in the cycle? This is a plot of the 7 last cycles, most of which were big ones, by the way. And the black line here is the average of those 7 cycles. The blue X on here is where we are in solar cycle 25 so far. So we're below the average of those last 7 cycles, but nonetheless about average for a solar cycle. And it would predict that we should be starting very soon into the decline of this cycle. It will be a long, slow decline over the next 5 or 6 years. By the way, one of the things to note is we tend to get the big flares during the declining phase of the cycle, not the rising phase. So we can look forward to some big flares in the next few years. I maintain that solar cycle 25 is an approximately average cycle. If you go back over the last 400 years of solar observations, about 150 is the average. There have been some predictions made over the years. NOAA and NASA predicted most recently a maximum between 150 and 180. They did start out at about 120, but revised it a couple of years ago. I predicted back in 2020 that the cycle will be about 165. The average peak, as I say, is about 150, and so this is about an average cycle, maybe slightly larger. Everybody is predicting that the cycle will peak approximately late 2024, early 2025, and I will go along with that quite happily. And the length of the cycle based on the migration of the sunspots towards the equator is about 11 years. So it's going to be pretty much a standard cycle just about every way you look at it. Well, what about total solar radiance? That's the important factor as far as the climate is concerned, because that defines how much energy the sun is giving us. Well, Grand Solar Minimum News put their foot in their mouth again by saying it's impossible to get an up-to-date measurement of total solar radiance, which means they're not really looking very hard, because after one click on Google, I got this plot, which is today's total solar radiance, and you can see it's much higher than solar cycle 24. So solar cycle 24 is the orange one in the middle there. The red on the right is solar cycle 25 so far. Now, what happens if we went into a grand solar minimum? Well, the bottom would drop out of the total solar radiance market, and it would drop to about 0.1% of its current value. That, if you calculate it, is about 0.2 degrees centigrade cooler than we are now. And if it stayed that way for 70 years, so in 70 years, we'd lose about 10 years worth of solar warming. So we'd be, after 70 years, at the equivalent of 60 years worth of global warming rather than 70, assuming there's no acceleration in it. So even if we went into a grand solar minimum, the difference it would make would be marginal. And most of the studies that have looked at this agree with that particular statement. Another claim that's being made by lots of people is we're seeing one of the coldest winters on record. No, we're not. 2024 was the warmest year on record. December of 2024, which was the beginning of winter, was the second warmest on record. And if you go around the planet for that, North America and the Caribbean was the warmest, South America 6th warmest, Europe 6th warmest, Africa 9th warmest, Asia 2nd warmest, Australasia 2nd warmest, and all the oceans together 2nd warmest. That all adds together to it being the second warmest December on record. The unfortunate thing is 2024, being the warmest year on record, exceeded the 1.5 degrees centigrade benchmark that everybody was worrying about. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that we've exceeded it permanently. It'll depend what happens this year, but it's a very worrying trend. Now what will happen this year? It'll depend a lot on El Nino, La Nina. If the La Nina that we're forming now is a harsh one, then temperatures will drop significantly. If not, then we could be seeing one of the top warmest years on record, maybe even the warmest year on record for 2025. We'll have to wait and see. Probably by the middle of the year we should know which way the climate is going to go. We can draw some conclusions, but at the moment there is no evidence for a grand solar minimum. Solar cycle 25 is approximately an average cycle. It's at least 30% bigger than solar cycle 24, which is against the predictions of the GSM crowd. But it hasn't peaked yet. As of June 2024, the smooth sunspot number was still going up. We won't know when it's peaked until at least a year after it does, because there's often a second or a third peak that you have to take into account. That fooled a lot of people for solar cycle 24, by the way. There is no sign of a sudden decline in solar activity, in flares or sunspot numbers, so there's no evidence that we're going into this sudden decline. And so there's no evidence that a grand solar minimum is imminent, and certainly no evidence that it will cause a mini ice age like some people claim. So, Happy New Year, everybody. Thank you for watching. Stay safe until next time. Goodbye.